Hi, everyone. Welcome to our virtual space here. I think our flow is, well, it's still kind of, people are still steadily coming in, but I might as well begin my, pre-event logistics. So let's go ahead and start that so we can get this conversation going. Again, welcome to this Montana Book Festival MBF Plus event. It is taking place in partnership with Fact and Fiction Books here in Missoula, Montana. We took February off and we're back with 3 really, really wonderful events this month in March, including this one tonight. And we have more events coming to you this spring. So keep an eye out for those. My name is Lauren Korn. I'm the director of the Montana Book Festival. As usual, I kind of want to take care of some housekeeping before we turn things over to Rob and Jamie tonight. First off, if you're interested in purchasing copies of Rob's book, The Grizzly in the Driveway, I urge you to purchase them from our festival partner, Fact and Fiction Books, who has agreed to donate 10% of all book sales of festival titles, including MBF Plus titles, back to the festival. So you go to factandfictionbooks.com and enter MBF at checkout, and we'll get 10% of those proceeds. So help support the festival. Regarding questions, audience questions, feel free to submit your questions to Rob and Jamie via the Q&A at the bottom of your screens. Here on the back end of things, we'll be reading questions. Jamie is actually going to try to address your questions during the conversation and rather than address them at the end. So he'll be keeping an eye on them there, and I'll monitor the chat to make sure that any questions are thrown back into the Q&A. And I'll be throwing out some links too. With that though, I'd like to introduce you to Rob and Jamie. Author Rob Chaney is a lifelong resident of Montana, a veteran reporter for the Missoulian, and a 2020 Neiman Fellow. He is the author of our featured book tonight, The Grizzly in the Driveway, The Return of Bears to a Crowded American West. There he is. Hi, Rob. Jamie Jonkel is a wildlife management specialist who brings over 45 years of experience with wildlife management and conflict reduction to his position with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. He has worked in Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Alaska, New Mexico, Canada, and Russia with various private and public entities, including National Geographic, Hornacher Wildlife Research Institute, Glacier Institute, Interagency Grizzly Bear Study, Glacier National Park Wolf Ecology Project, Idaho Fish and Game, Maine Fish and Wildlife, Border Grizzly Bear Project, and several privately owned ranches. He has been with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks since 1996. Jamie received his bachelor's in wildlife biology and a minor in journalism from the University of Montana here in Missoula. Welcome, Rob, and welcome, Jamie. Oh, and I guess I should note that Jamie doesn't have video tonight, so we're not going to see him and all his glory, but we will hear his wonderful voice. So welcome, Rob. Welcome, Jamie. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Really happy to be here. Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, and thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion, and be glad you don't have video of me. I'm looking pretty scruffy and a little sloppy right now. So I guess with that, I just wanted to say, Rob, I really enjoyed your book. I have a little cabin up in the Blackfoot Valley that I have to snowmobile into, and I curled up with your book over about 3 different weekends and read through it, and very much enjoyed it, and I highly recommend it. And I know you got some good reviews from Kirkus and Hollywood Soapbox and Litany West, the Missoulian, of course, and everyone thought it was wonderful. So there's some crazy times going on right now in the politics of Grizzly, and I, for one, have to be a little careful. It's dangerous times for grizzly bears, and it's dangerous times for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks bear managers and bear scientists. But I think your book is very, very timely, and it might be good for you to give the audience a quick synopsis of sort of what I'm talking about.
Well, I just actually spent all day today reviewing legislative testimony before the transmittal. There's a bunch of bills coming through to rearrange the way Montanans manage and relate to grizzly bears. And that was a big part of the reason why I decided to write this book was after literally decades of this very slow incremental effort to try to recover a species that for most of that time, very few people ever actually saw or encountered. All of a sudden, the tempo just started to scramble. In 2007, we had the first attempt to delist greater Yellowstone grizzlies, and that fell apart, and that triggered a whole bunch of new research. And part of the reason that thing fell apart was how quickly some food sources for bears just vanished. The court, in large part, threw out that delisting effort because white bark pine and cutthroat trout in Yellowstone were suddenly questionable as to whether or not they were a food source. And the reason they had become questionable was because after the fires of 1998 and then the pine bark beetle, the white bark pine had just about been wiped out from Yellowstone. And the introduction of lake trout in Yellowstone Lake had suddenly wiped out the cutthroat. And so changes were happening really fast. And I also saw, forgive me, the passing of your father, Chuck Jonkel, was just sort of a earth-shaking moment when I realized that this one generation of people, one class of biologists and policymakers and people who were interested in bears had gone through their entire careers and were now directors of agencies or retiring, or in the case of your father, passing on. And their entire career had been from the bear almost being gone to the bear almost being recovered. And I thought that's the right time to try to figure out what did we just do and how fast do we have to finish the job.
Well, yes, your book will give everyone an excellent background, on how things were 40 years ago and how things have changed in 40 years. And you're probably going to have enough material in the next couple of years to write a whole second book. So I'm looking forward to that.
In just this year.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah. Well,
go ahead.
In your book, I really enjoyed, and was proud that you mentioned my father. And you wrote about, the incident Dad had where he had to shoot a grizzly years ago in self-defense. And Dad actually was asked to write an article for what was then sort of Montana Outdoors. It's not the same as Montana Outdoors. And he actually drafted the article, and he just didn't feel comfortable, having it published. And then a good friend of his named Jim Rice, who was a filmmaker up in Whitefish, convinced Chuck to try writing the story again. So Jim produced a pretty good document. And at the last minute, Dad said, no, I don't want to have it published. And after Father died, I found both copies of of those two articles, and someday I'd love to show you those. I think you'd very much enjoy reading them.
Absolutely.
But I was just curious, when was the first time you met my father? What was the situation, or where did you first meet him?
So I had seen him on occasion helping put together the International Wildlife Film Festival right here in Missoula, which Chuck Jonkel was instrumental in changing the way that we looked at wildlife, and particularly the popular versions of wildlife, where we had all of these nature faker, really humanized stories of cute critters or exciting critters or otherwise pretty imaginary critters. And he set up a film festival that required scientific rigor and actual field work, and really kind of kicked to the curb the Disney-fied, lemmings jumping off a cliff, nature faker stuff. And so I'd sort of known about him from that. And then when I was a very young reporter at the Hungry Horse News, I got assigned to cover one of his classes up at the Glacier Institute. And that happened to be the time that I got to hear him tell the story of catching a grizzly bear in a black bear snare. And he and a partner were trying to figure out what to do. And there was a log between them and the bear came over the log, and the partner who had the shotgun, if I'm telling this right, Jamie, correct me if I'm wrong, the partner fell over, and Chuck was in the middle, and the bear was coming at him, and all Chuck had was a Colt Woodsman 22 caliber pistol, which is just a little bit bigger than a BB gun. And he shot the bear right in the head, and the bullet went kapwing right off the bear's forehead. And he shot it again and again and again, and the bullets just kept bouncing off the bear's head, but it would back up and recover and shake itself loose and come back again. And he finally, forgive me for folks who are not used to this kind of detail, but he finally put one straight up the eye socket, and that killed the bear. It turned out to be, I believe, the last bullet in the gun. And then he reaches up and he pulls up the skull of that bear and shows us the little tiny hole in the eye socket that finished the job. And so, we're all in the thrall of this great bear story. It's like, wow, these are really cool. And this is a guy who's really been there. But then, and this is what made it so really, really gripping. We went out into Glacier Park and drove up the Going to the Sun Road like every other tourist does. And Chuck gets out on a roadside turnout, and we all go follow him, and he walks straight into the alder thicket. And anybody who's ever been caught in an alder thicket knows that it's the worst kind of jungle you can find in the Alpine. This stuff is just thick, and you can't punch your way through it. And Chuck gets down on all fours and goes in, and we realize that there's a trail as wide as the Highline Trail right through this thicket that bears have made for centuries. And they've got a maze of these trails going in places we never even realized they could go. And then he reaches over and he pulls out what I thought was a piece of grass, and it turns out it's a wild onion. And you take a bite of that wild onion, and you've got that flavor in your mouth for the rest of the day, and probably on your breath. And you suddenly realize how to see the world like a bear. And then you realize what kind of an impact he had on every single person who went through his class, and got this understanding of how to see the world through another creature's existence.
Yeah, he was quite the character. I'm actually staring at the skull right now. I hate to say this, his ashes are right there too. Father left us with a rather difficult assignment. I didn't know this until I watched a film that was put together on my father called Walking Bear Comes Home. Great Bear Foundation put it together, and it's kind of fun to watch. But in there, he talks about where he wants his ashes. And he wants his ashes in the middle of James Bay, Quebec, up on North Twin Island in this one bear den. And I put some of his ashes in with my mother and took him to a couple of special places around here. And then when they did a Churchill Travelers trip a few years ago, they took some ashes up there as well. But my assignment to get the remaining ashes up to the bear den in the middle of James Bay has created a little bit of a dilemma for me.
I'll bet.
But,
especially if that den's still occupied.
Yeah, but that's Dad. He never really felt right about having to put down that bear. He quite often talked to me about the errors they had made that day. But the skull has been a very excellent education prop, and is always quite a little surprise when people can look at it and see those dents in the skull from the 22, and then the actual entry. So my father is very, very lucky.
Yep.
So I know that you started your career with the Hungry Horse News, and really the Hungry Horse News sort of was right there when a lot of the nation's attention focused in on grizzlies and Glacier Park, the management of grizzlies, and with Jack Olson's book, Night of the Grizzlies. But I know that Mel Reuter, started the Hungry Horse News, and he was right on top of all of that reporting when those two gals were killed on the same night by two different grizzlies. And I was wondering if your experience there at Hungry Horse News, and I was also curious if you'd ever got to meet Mel Reuter.
Mm-hmm.
Wondering if that sort of might have led to some of your interest covering grizzly bears today and writing this book.
That had a huge influence, but not quite the way you'd expect. So I did get to know Mel a little bit. He'd retired from publishing at that point, and Brian Kennedy was the editor and publisher at the time. Brian had a sort of a standing rule for us that any bear picture we got went on the cover, and anytime we had a bear on the cover, circulation jumped 30% that week. So, it was a driving force. And full disclosure, in all of my years at the Hungry Horse News, I never put a grizzly bear on the cover. I got a lot of black bears up there, but I never actually got close enough to a grizzly bear to get a Hungry Horse News quality shot of one. But the coverage of the Night of the Grizzlies is a really fascinating historical event when you think of everything else that got tangled around up with it, because that happened at the same time. And I'll try to compress a whole bunch of stuff into one place here. But John and Frank Craighead were the two instrumental grizzly researchers in Yellowstone National Park, and they kind of laid the groundwork for grizzly biology. They also pioneered the whole radio collar concept. The first radio collars were done in the early 1960s on marmots, and the second radio collars were done on grizzly bears. And they kind of revolutionized what we could learn about bears, because before that, all we could do was hang streamers out of their ears as a way to identify which bear was which at a distance that was safe enough to work with. And the Craigheads had this long-running and very popular, very social media conscious back in the 1960s, and the Mutual of Omaha, Wild Kingdom, and Walt Disney, and all these other National Geographic TV dinner kinds of opportunities where they would show what was going on with the bears. And then a new administration came into Yellowstone, and 1972 was Yellowstone's centennial, and they were trying to figure out how do we, record the century of the park, and what do we need to do to spruce it up. And one of the things they were really concerned about was the unnaturalness of things in the park. They wanted to get everything back to natural. And one of the first things they looked at was the Craighead brothers bears with these streamers and radio collars running around. And they thought, this is unnatural. We need to get rid of this. And at the same time, they were saying, Yellowstone had a huge thing about setting up bleachers around the garbage dumps for all the big hotels. And they'd have spotlights, and they'd bring everybody out right after dinner around sunset to watch the grizzlies come out of the forest and poke their way through the garbage dumps looking for food. And the Craigheads had done a lot of research on these garbage bears. So the park administration said, we are going to get rid of the dumps. These are unnatural. We're shutting them down. And the Craigheads protested, saying, if you do that, you're going to wind up with a whole bunch of bears who are accustomed to this food source and don't have a replacement. Trouble's going to happen. And this debate was going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And then 1967 happens up in Glacier, and two women on two separate campgrounds are killed by two separate bears on the same night. And now, if that's not a black swan, low probability event, I don't know a better definition.
Yeah, that was insane.
Everybody out.
Yeah. And there's really an excellent documentary that's not glorified, that was put together, oh boy, it's been 10 years ago now, but it was called Night of the Grizzlies. That is very much worth reading. Jack Olson's book is very much worth reading, but it was really, that was when the tide turned. We pretty much, emasculated the grizzly prior to that. And when, Yellowstone Park sort of became a park, and Glacier Park, the image of the Teddy Roosevelt teddy bear kind of took over. And, granted, the bear populations at that time were so low, but it was that night that really changed everything. And really, you cover that wonderfully in the book with the whole explanation of all the animosity between the park and the Craighead brothers, and the closing of the dumps, and all the turmoil where everyone started focusing on grizzlies. And really, that's when the Endangered Species Act came into being. The grizzly bears were placed on the Endangered Species Act. And that's when, the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee sort of was established. And it wasn't a congenial thing, it was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service more or less saying, listen, Glacier National Park, listen, Yellowstone National Park, listen, state of Montana, state of Wyoming, you guys are messing things up. And hence you will be working together on the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee.
Yep.
And, that whole process was fascinating. And I love the way you covered it in your book. And I don't know if you want to give people a quick little synopsis of how that changed things, what direction it put things in.
So the Craighead brothers got essentially ejected from Yellowstone, and Yellowstone bears immediately got ejected from the dumps, and they started going, as predicted, into the campgrounds and the parking lots and everywhere else. And more than 100 bears were killed by park rangers or biologists or other bear managers in conflicts in like the next year and a half. It was just a disaster. But on a really odd personal note, I grew up in Missoula, Montana, and I would ride my bike along Campus Drive at the base of Mount Sentinel And as I'd pass the gym that's now the ROTC headquarters there, I'd look down. If you hit just the right spot, you'd see a golden eagle in a cage down there. And that was always my little landmark, a really cool thing for the day, if you could see the golden eagle. That golden eagle was John Craighead's. The Craighead brothers, by the way, if you ever read the book My Side of the Mountain, that was their sister writing about her crazy brothers learning how to be falconers and eagle raisers. The guy who had the job of exercising that eagle for John Craighead was a man named Chris Servine. And Chris Servine went from his time at the University of Montana learning to be a wildlife biologist to working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the grizzly got put on the endangered species list in 1975. Nobody really quite knew what to do or how to fix it until 1984, when a guy named Ron Wauer, I might be pronouncing that wrong, wrote a memo saying, in this time when we're all sitting here spinning our wheels, we may lose the grizzly bear entirely. It's going to disappear on our watch, except for a couple of little remnant populations in Glacier and Yellowstone, if we don't do something right away. And Servine happened to be working for Wauer. And so everybody at Washington was scratching their heads trying to figure out what to do. And they said, okay, let's come up with a plan. And Servine helped draft it together to create a thing called the Interagency Grizzly Committee. And the directors of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service handed it to the governors of Montana, Idaho, Washington, and Wyoming, and not the wildlife managers. And the governors, whether they were really deeply involved or maybe were just signing something on the fly, all signed off on it. And all of a sudden, this committee was there, and it had the power to make everybody else, all those state fish and wildlife agencies and the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management and the Department of the Interior and the Indian tribes who had reservations in grizzly country and the National Park Service and even the Canadians who had parks and wild country right on our border, all get together in a room and start working on this thing. And so that sort of stroke of bureaucratic luck put everybody together in harness to try to figure out how to save the bear. And I've got to say, those are, for something as exciting as grizzly bears, those are some of the most really boring meetings I have had to attend.
Yeah, I have to agree. I remember sitting at many a meeting and slightly nodding off and looking over and seeing you taking notes, but seeing your head bobbing a little bit. Well, when the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee first started, it was kind of a little tense, but over time, it was heavy on bureaucracy, but over time, I mean, the sleeves got rolled up and there was a lot of transition, new people coming in continually, and worked pretty hard, and I think having that structure overseeing the management of a species like the grizzly is really one of a kind, at least functioning at that high a level. Great headway has been made. I mean, we definitely are seeing grizzlies showing up all over, they're covering. And, 40 years, what do they say? A generation is roughly 25 years for a human. I just took a guess and figured a generation for a grizzly bear was probably 12, 13, something like that. In just this very short time, 2 human generations and, 4 or 5 grizzly generations, our bears have really done quite well. So I'm going to just change the subject a little bit because I was fascinated with this story. When you were working with the Hungry Horse News, you got to meet Leo Turner.
Yeah.
I had always heard the rumors, and I had heard the stories about that incident, but I was like, wow, that's pretty far-fetched, that could it really be that way? And I got some insight from Tim Manley and some of the wardens and stuff, but really when I read your book, that was the first time I got a feeling for the whole story. And it's really quite an amazing story. You might want to give people just a quick little nibble on that one.
Sure. So the story started with just a tip that some crazy old Vietnam vet had killed a grizzly bear with a knife. Go find him. And nobody knew who he was. The whole incident was under investigation. So we weren't releasing names. We weren't releasing any details of where it happened or anything like that, except that it was somewhere vaguely in the area of Big Fork. And Brian Kennedy told me, go find him. So I went out and literally went door to door, just banging on people's doorbells and saying, have you heard about this incident where somebody killed a bear on last Friday before last? And eventually they led me to Leo Turner. And I'm thumbing through the book here because I've got a picture of him. I found his place and there's just this wall of dog barking going on. And I'm like, oh boy, what am I walking into? It's a Rottweiler farm. Leo Turner raised Rottweilers. And so I walk up to the door thinking I'm going to have my leg bit off any moment here. And this very nice, very small man with two gigantic Rottweilers at his side comes out and says, what can I do for you? And I say, I hear that something wild happened here. He says, oh yeah, let me show you. And so we go out to his backyard and he had this kennel for his dogs and it was crushed. And the kennel rails are made out of 2x6s and they are snapped. And he said, I was hearing my dogs making these weird noises and I came out to see what was going on and something came lunging out and I shot it and I jumped back way farther than I thought I ever could and way farther than my doctor who, since I've got bronchitis, says I should ever be able to move. But I don't know what it was. And so I went back and got a friend and a flashlight. And my friend came out with a double barrel shotgun. And I came out with a pistol in my belt and a knife in my hand because in the dark, a knife is better. I'm like, who has this idea of a knife is better in the dark when you're after something that's big enough to scatter a Rottweiler kennel? And here's Leo in his kennel. So if you can see it there. And he says, well, that's what they taught me to do in the A-team in Vietnam. And at that time, this is 1999. The A-team for me was the TV show with Mr. T and Face. And, I love it when a plan comes together and I pity the fool. And this totally, made up melodramatic goofball Thursday night TV stuff. No. Leo Turner was a member of the Special Forces A-team, and he had his certificate on the wall. And he went out in the dark with bronchitis and a K-bar in his hand. And when he saw something on the ground and it moved, he jumped on it and stabbed it. And it turned out to be a grizzly bear so big it took a winch on a pickup truck and 3 men to get it out of his yard. And they determined, I think pretty reasonably, that it was a case of justifiable self-defense, and he was never charged for the incident. But that's the kind of bears that are running around right on the edge of people's houses, on the edge of the Rocky Mountains where we all live. And it really kind of brings home how close we are to bear country and how close bears are to our country. And, what are we going to do about that? And I wish I had an answer. I wish I had a good strategy or a way to make people comfortable who really don't like the idea of bears, or the way to make bear fans understand the visceral fear that people who don't like bears have, and try to find some middle ground for them. When I was listening to the testimony from the legislature today, and the people were talking about how, I can't have my grandkids come over to Shodo anymore and go fishing with me because there's bears in the fishing holes. Who's going to send their grandkid out where a 500-pound predator might run off with them? On the other hand, grizzly bears and wolves are one of the biggest financial draws for people who come to Glacier and Yellowstone National Park. They are a huge support to our local economy, for people who come out for a chance to see one and snap a picture of one. And like any keystone predator, they are a massive part of the ecosystem balance that is going to keep all the rest of the species underneath them in play and in check. And I don't have a good solution for that, but part of the reason I wrote this was to at least give people the ammunition to ask better questions, and to try to think of, what do I really feel about these bears? Or what are the things that I have never really thought about that other people are worried about, and that I ought to at least have some encounter with?
Well, it's fascinating for me, and I'm sure you've seen it as well, just how different people think about grizzlies from one area to another. I'll be in Missoula, and folks in Missoula are totally different than folks in Darby, and people in Darby are totally different than the folks that live down by St. Regis. And then, you go over to the university, completely different philosophies. Everyone, always has this concept of how it should be done. And, there's a lot of opinions on how it should be done. And what always strikes me is so many of the people I talk to look at it too simply. They always have these sort of cut and dry, like, well, this is what needs to be done. We just need to play music to the bears, and they can live in harmony with us if you sing to them. And then another guy is like, well, you put a little strychnine on the weenies and hang them on the barbed wire. No more grizzly problem, and you just get it. It's crazy. It's insane. But people don't seem to see all the intricacies, all the little innuendos of how difficult it is to manage a species like a grizzly bear, or an elephant, or a polar bear, or any animal, that is large in this world today. And I was just, you address that in your book, but in your interviews, you talk to a lot of different people. And the one that really struck me was, your chapter on the spirit animal.
Yeah.
Looking at it from the Indian perspective. And I'm glad you did that.
Yeah, they, you talk about everybody having different attitudes about bears. One of the things that really kind of amazed me was, within Indian cultures. I want to be very careful here. I'm not an ethnographer or tribal member or any other sort of authority on this other than what is publicly available. But the bear in so many indigenous cultures is itself an incredibly mixed character. Let me literally give you an example here. This is a little carved bear that I like to keep on my desk. And it's made by a Salish artist. And, it's got the two sides of its existence. It's a actual animal, and it is a spiritual creature. And within, just for example, the Kootenai tribe, which, we're living on Kootenai land here, a collection of Kootenai Y stories I have. The grizzly is the leader of the Council of Animals, the giver of wisdom, the provider of medicine, the rudest, most obnoxious animal in the whole neighborhood, the one that is the most mischievous and frequently violent and unfriendly, the one that is the most powerful, the one that is often the dumbest, the one that is the easiest to fool, the one that is the most wise and the biggest source of necessary information. It's just, like the entire Greek pantheon of gods all smashed into one critter, sometimes within the same story. And when I, started looking at that and seeing how all of these other communities relate to charismatic megafauna like the bear, it really brought up the point that when we are doing something, you got to ask, who's we? Are we the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee? Are we the Montana legislature? Are we Congress? Are we the United States versus Canada? Are we North America versus Eurasia, where there's a whole lot of bears, and all the way down to Mongolia and Morocco? And we have all of these different ways of working with them and different ways of respecting them and including them in our mythology and our spirituality and our economy. All of a sudden, I had to go back through the book page by page and check how many times I used the word we. And if I was conscious about who I thought we was. And I realized I didn't know. I included people who probably didn't think that they belonged in that we, that they were radically opposed to the community that I thought we all belonged to.
Yeah, it's really, I always laugh, I find myself doing it once in a while. I'm a fourth generation Montanan, when you think about the first people here in the Americas, I mean, thousands and thousands of generations just living with grizzlies and black bears, and really in Europe, our past, the European past, grizzlies, grizzly mythology, very important, going way, way back, and things have certainly changed. Really, I brought this up in a little presentation I did the other day for the Travelers Rest folks in a winter storytelling session, but I just got to thinking about the length of time, that European man has been here. And the Vikings arrived in 1000, and then 500 years went by. And then the Europeans arrived. We had the Spanish via Christopher Columbus start, checking the interior out. We had the French arrive. We had the British arrive. And really, another 500 years went by, roughly to today's date. And the change that had occurred in just that short time, it made me think about these old devils. You know, you always hear about the old woman that lived to 120, you know, died in the old folks home. You know, I'm like, whoa, 120. Well, when you think about that and you go back 120 years, you know, you think, well, there was another old timer that might have lived to 120 and another one. You know, that's 5 or 6 old timers, you know, since European man arrived in North America. And my God, the change that has occurred is just mind boggling. Yeah, it really makes me think about things. You know, I'm curious. You know, in 50 years, what do you see? In 100 years, what do you see? In 500 years, God forbid, what do you see?
Well, let me back up a little bit before I jump forward that far. Think of what we've done just in the time that we've been trying to recover the grizzly bear. We had the Craighead brothers right around the time I was born coming up with the first radio collar. And all that radio collar could do was beep to another radio, and you might be able to figure out where the bear was. That was 1967. And now I've got this in my hand, and I have holding in my hand here more computing power than all of NASA had to put Neil Armstrong on the moon. Now, somebody made the point to me that if you use, forgive me, if you use war as an example, we fought wars from Alexander the Great all the way to Napoleon at the same speed, as fast as a horse could go. That was the fastest that anybody's army could move, from Alexander the Great to Napoleon. And one generation later, after the Battle of Waterloo, we have the American Civil War, where all of a sudden we've got steam engines and telegraph and machine guns, and the entire world is changed, and everybody's strategy that they had worked on for literally thousands of years is thrown out the window. Now think of what we have done, you and I, and all of our audience here, just in our lifetimes. We have gone from radio collars that go beep to radio collars that tell me if a lactating grizzly bear is overheating and needs to find a bath so that she can produce enough milk for her cubs when the temperature gets above 80 degrees. And it's beamed off of a satellite, and it goes to the Apple Watch on your wrist. We've tried to jam that much technology and that much artificial intelligence into our lives in the space of one generation. And you want me to guess what we're going to be doing in the next 50 years?
Yeah.
That's the other reason why I wanted to put this book together, is because our decision space is just collapsing like a black hole. When you factor in the challenge of climate change, when you factor in the challenge of population growth and our available resources and the mismatch that is available there, when you look at the damage that one little virus can do in this past year, what if that virus was just a little bit better? What if that virus was a little bit closer to Ebola than it was to SARS? How much mayhem we would be in, and whether our system that we've got set up around us is ready to handle it. And how much more delicate the grizzly bear system is, and we're trying to manage it like some big terrarium, I'm not sure we're up to the job.
Yeah, I worry. I daydream a lot, you know, trying to figure out what the future might look like. But for as smart as a species as we're supposed to be, you know, I sure wonder about us sometimes. It drives me insane. And I've had that same thought about Ebola. I mean, it almost happened. And boy, that would have been so different to the COVID outbreak. Now, I do see we have a question.
Oh, good.
Let's see. Karen Gonzalez says, couldn't we see bears behind the old gym at, I guess, the University of Montana? And I can answer that. I don't know if you guys were following the Missoula Bears updates and some of the University Dispatch updates, but we had a couple black bears that were real characters. I believe they came out of the rattlesnake. They were fully food conditioned, and we're slowly getting things somewhat cleaned up, garbage wise, bird feeder wise, apple wise, in the rattlesnake drainage. But we've had a lot of bears on the gravy train for a long time up there. And they shifted over into East Missoula, Bonner, Milltown. And a couple of them came out of the Hellgate Canyon area and started doing these forays all through the university district. And yeah, people were seeing them up behind the university. Oh, it says here, no, they were in a cage by the Golden Eagles. Okay.
Are you referring to Kerry Hunt's bears where we worked out the bear spray formulas?
Now, we also, at the University of Montana, had bear mascots. They actually had a grizzly as a bear mascot. Most of them were black bears. A lot of people aren't aware of this, but they had captive bears that they kept on campus and took to the various football games. This was all in the 40s. There's a really fascinating article on those bears. And yes, I believe some of those bears were actually kept on campus. And before that, they had captive bears in Greeno Park as well. Mm-hmm. If you've gone into Greeno Park and seen the bear cage there, but who knows? You know, the Craigheads, who knows what they were doing behind the old man's gym? They could have had a bear there as well. But those two bears that were all around the university were pretty cool. We're starting to see some grizzlies, you know, around Missoula. All last fall, we had a grizzly bear working the North Hills, actually got into a chicken coop in the Butler Creek area, and then people were seeing tracks. I believe it was just one bear, but in the last 10 years or so, we're starting to see a fair amount of grizzly activity in and around the Five Valleys area. We even had a second grizzly show up last year in the town of Lolo. You know, the year before we had a collared grizzly come out of the cabinets and get pretty close to Lolo. Of course, we had the Stevensville grizzly, which you talk about. I really like the fact that you, it said it wasn't around the 40s, it was the early 70s. I thought it was the Craigheads. Well, you know, like I said, the Craigheads could have easily had a bear back behind there, very easily. So, yeah, they were, you know, based out of the science complex, and yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't have a bear there. I'll ask young John Craighead if he ever remembers anything about a bear being behind the old man's gym there.
Jamie, were you involved in the bear spray work?
You know, I helped Dad and Carrie out with that. That was fascinating. That was right out at Fort Missoula in the old Italian prisons. During World War II, they had Italian war prisoners at two prison sites at Fort Missoula. And Dad and Carrie Hunt were able to get a hold of 4 of those old cells, and they converted them where they put a trap door between the 2 prison cells, and they had black bears, and then they had several grizzlies out there as well. And yes, that's where Carrie Hunt did her study on aversive conditioning with bear spray. They also looked at skunk spray, ammonia, all sorts of other things. Those pins have been shut down for quite some time. But yeah, we had captive grizzlies right out there at Fort Missoula. And that was in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. Yeah.
So Jamie, something I get asked a lot, and you probably can lay down some serious field experience, is the question of bear spray versus gums if you are encountering a bear. And I know you carry both, but what would you tell folks when they're asking the advice for going into the woods?
Well, you bet. So I carry bear spray with me at all times, mostly for these angry people I have to work with at times. But I'm far more frightened of running into someone that might do bodily harm to me. You just never know. So I always have bear spray for that reason. But I also, when I'm in the woods, I carry it with me at all times. Even if I troop off to the outhouse from the cabin, which is 100 feet away, I carry a can of bear spray, and I have a can of bear spray in the outhouse. When people are recreating right around the town of Missoula, I tell them to carry bear spray because there are more black bears in and around the fringes of Missoula than there are up in the mountains. And it's because of this glut of food. And it all has to do with the enhancement of prime habitat. People often think that, when people move in, they take it away from the animal, to the bear, the deer, the elk, or whatever. And in the past, that did occur. They were displaced. But over the last 15 to 20 years here in the West, we're starting to see what they call the urban interface effect. We have enhanced really good habitat by sprinkling it with water, in exotic grasses, growing crabapple trees and fruit trees and plum trees and apricots and growing alfalfa. And so really some of the best wildlife habitat right now is this urban wildlands habitat or the agricultural interface. So I try to get people to carry bear spray anywhere they are in Montana, and not just for bears. I mean, if you get a randy whitetail buck, that is used to being hand fed by Grandma Jessie at such and such street up in the Rattlesnake, he in the rut might, want to do a little bit more than, take some bread out of your hand. And it's nice to have some bear spray. A cow elk, coming after you because you got too close to her calf, comes in handy to have bear spray. A cow moose, that you startle on the trail, might be kind of handy to have a can of bear spray. Now I do carry a firearm too, when I'm in the backcountry, but I have worked in some real remote areas, like up in Alaska, and I just have both, but it's the bear spray that's always close at hand. And then I have that firearm there just in case I need it, as a backup. But so many people are so quick to go with the gun, but when you think about it, with grizzlies, I mean, they are an amazingly powerful animal. They can take extreme injury and still cause harm. And times, if you really want to get hurt, best way to do that is pull out a pistol and wound a grizzly that might just enhance its level of attack. So I strongly encourage people to go the old skunk method and carry bear spray.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. let's see, I see it's 7:01. I think it was only supposed to be an hour, but we'll see.
You're keeping track. You're keeping close track, Jamie. Yeah, okay. Well, it doesn't look like we have any more audience questions, so let's call it. Rob, Jamie, thank you so much for being here. To you, the audience, thank you for being here as well and for participating. Just as a reminder to you, you can purchase The Grizzly in the Driveway on Fact and Fiction's website online, factandfictionbooks.com. There it is in all its beauty. And do remember to enter MBF at checkout so that 10% of your purchase comes back to the festival, so that we can continue programming like this. We're going to be announcing our plans for the 2021 Montana Book Festival very soon, so stay tuned for that as well. Again, Rob, Jamie, thank you for your knowledge and your stories. Everyone, have a really wonderful night.
Thank you all. Lauren, thank you so much. Shout out to you and my friend Gwen Florio coming up here very soon.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think it started.
All right. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yep,
All right. Thanks, everyone.
very much.